With more than 25 years of experience in the energy commodity supply and energy efficiency markets, Mark Pruitt assists organizations with energy planning, project evaluation, procurement processes, and contract negotiations. He currently advises communities on municipal aggregation and organizations on energy procurement issues. His experience through the electricity deregulation process in Illinois provides him with a long-range perspective on positioning, risk management, and opportunity development. Prior to founding the Power Bureau, Mark served as the first director of the Illinois Power Agency. There, he secured electricity supply on behalf of approximately 4.7 million residential and small commercial ratepayer accounts serviced by IOUs. Today, Mark will provide an industry update.
Okay, sound-wise? Great, I got a thumbs up. Thank you very much for inviting me here last year. So this year's presentation is based on last year's invitation. So thank you all very much, and I'm glad to see you all. Some of you might not recognize me. I know I don't recognize everyone here, but I came to be more familiar with AIEC and the co-op environment when I worked at the state of Illinois. I was a director of a state agency that negotiated wholesale power rates for Ameren and Commonwealth Edison. So learning about the co-op environment from that regulatory standpoint really gave me an appreciation for the value that you bring your members. And I've always been appreciative of the information that AIEC and your members have provided. So my thanks to you, and hopefully presentation today will give you a little bit of maybe a little bit of insight into what's happening here in Illinois and how it might impact how you are going to be operating as co-ops moving into the future. This is just the outline. I'm not a slide reader, so if you want to look at the pictures on the slide or the text on the slide, that's up to you. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight the things that I think are most important on the slide. So we'll do a little bit of introductions, then we'll talk about current legislative proposals, because legislation is driving the policy is going to drive the economics. So if you've heard about some policy issues already, that's great. Don't tune me out. We're going to translate that policy into dollars, which is always the most important thing. So stick with me, have a little faith, and we'll get to something that I think might be of interest to you when we talk about the potential impacts of these policies on MISO Zone 4, which is where most of the co-ops are operating. And then some conclusions. Well, I'll do some minor pontificating. So with that, as was mentioned in the intro, I didn't know there was going to be that. That's very nice. Thank you. I won't read through this, but I'm an independent consultant. As my 19-year-old daughter says, I specialize in nerd things. So I do a lot of analysis and power market transactions. I also teach at University of Illinois, Chicago, and Northwestern. But suffice to say, I'm not one of those Chicago people. I do wander south of I-80 with some frequency. I did my undergrad work at Peoria and have been in Springfield a number of times over the years. My main claim to fame is that I used to be somebody in Illinois. I used to be the director of the Illinois Power Agency. And with that, I gained an appreciation for how policy is driven in Illinois. Spoiler alert, and with all due respect to the legislators and others, it's not a real strong suit, right? There are some things that have gone very right in Illinois from a policy perspective in the energy sector, and there's other things that have not gone so well. So being in the state government apparatus for a few years of my career gave me some insight as to, if we're going to talk about policy in Illinois, it can't just be somebody's bumper sticker idea. There has to be some carryover into what are the implications of the policy. So that's a little bit of what we'll talk about today. And then I also do some research and some board memberships. So I spent a quarter at Northwestern working with some master's degree students, and this is the topic. This is it. So you get a full quarter's worth of education in one slide. When we talk about policy, right, Policy is great. That's an idea. That's an objective. That's a concept. That's something we want to accomplish. But if energy policy is not aligned with how the markets operate, or it's not aligned with how regulation operates, or regulation is not allowed to react and respond to how the markets operate, you have these disconnects, right? So, give you a few examples. If a policy is not aligned with how the market operates, you get price spikes, you get market distortion, because what you're saying you want in the policy is not available in the world. It doesn't work that way. Good example of this policy is the Illinois Clean Coal Portfolio Standard. It's a policy that's on the books that's supposed to support clean coal asset development. It has never worked because it doesn't comply with how the market operates, period. If policy is getting to such a level of detail when an energy bill is 800, 900 pages long, right? It's wandering from policy into regulation. It's telling the regulators, this is how we're going to do it. Policy needs to stay on the objective side, and the regulators need to regulate, right? Because they understand the market, they understand how things work. When policy is misaligned with regulation, that's where you have special interest legislation that comes in, and that's where you have regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a situation where the regulator, be it the Illinois Commerce Commission, FERC, any of these other energy regulators, do not have the authority or the ability to adjust how we fulfill a policy, right? It's like not trusting your colleague to make decisions in a negotiation, right? It becomes very inefficient, and what happens when you have policymakers who delve into the regulatory side of how the energy markets work, you end up having this cycle of repeated revisiting of energy legislation every 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. That's why we have these omnibus energy bills in Illinois with some frequency, right? We're constantly changing the rules. And that's regulatory capture. That means that the Illinois Commerce Commission, as an example, doesn't have the ability to come up with good regulation so that these markets can operate as intended. And then lastly, if regulation is misaligned with the markets, that's where you have market abuses. That's where market manipulation can occur, and a lack of transparency. Why did prices go up? We don't know, because we can't tell, right? We don't have visibility into how these markets are operating. So, you are now consultants. You understand how this all works. So, again, I'm not going to read this to you. The purpose of this slide is to say that there were numerous legislative proposals. Here are some of them in the table. They were, many of them, intended to address the shortcomings of the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was the last 800-page energy bill that was passed in 2016. Some of these are seeking some very narrow benefits for individual market participants, and others are, moving towards kind of more dramatic changes in the market. The idea was, as I understood it, was let's have all these bills get introduced during session, and then by the end of session, the end of May, all the best proposals would be brought together into an omnibus bill, and it would be passed. That's, based on the people I speak to, that was the idea. Some of the bills of notice here, Path to 100, essentially sought to increase the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, right, for Commonwealth Edison and Ameren. The Clean Energy Jobs Act was an example of kind of a more all-encompassing bill that was really trying to change a lot of how the adding elements into the utility offerings for Commonwealth Edison and Ameren, and then kind of on and on. So that didn't really happen. Things got stalled. We'll just put it that way. They couldn't come to agreement on all the terms. One other interesting aspect of the legislative session was that there really isn't a final bill that's being debated. It's a draft bill, right? It hasn't even been introduced. Another odd aspect of this is that, unlike in the past, no authoritative voice has come forward and said, this is what the bill is going to cost. Usually, if it's a bill that's proposed by Exelon or by the solar industry or by some other entity, at least they'll try to pencil out some element of what is this going to cost. That wasn't done at all, unless I missed it. So for some clients, I did the accounting, and that's the table here. And you see in the center column, headed 2022, that's the first year cost to ComEd and Ameren customers for what I could account for in this omnibus bill. So almost $1 billion in the first year. Pushing that tally out through 2031 gets us to about $15 billion. Now you're talking real money, right? And this is just the stuff that we know, that we can say, hey, it says $2 million a year, right? There's a number of proposals in here that we can't account for because it's to be determined. There's not even a formula to tell us what the spending is going to be. So, you know, in a sense, I'm a little torn. Something this ambiguous means this is really the Consultant Full Employment Act, right? This is going to be really good for me and attorneys. So any attorneys among you, this is a gold mine. But this is kind of the state of play. And part of the challenge is that it's so complex and so heavy that it hasn't been able to really gel and become a firm proposal. So there was no vote in the regular session by May 31. There were some negotiations, and the legislators came back in June. They weren't able to even come forward with a firm bill to be voted on. Exelon filed decommissioning plans because they have a big ask in here. They want some subsidies for 2 of their nuclear power plants in northern Illinois. Without the bill passing, they're not going to get it. So they said, fine, we're going to decommission 2 of these plants, and they filed those decommissioning plans this week. The veto session is now scheduled for the latter half of October, and you know, maybe that's when the legislature takes this up again. I don't know. You know, I hear conflicting stories that they're close, they're not close, that negotiations are occurring between labor and the environmental community, that those are the parties in the room that are really having what I understand is a rather robust conversation, also known as an argument, about whether the bill should have firm closure dates for fossil fuel plants, 2035 for coal plants, 2045 for natural gas plants. And you know, that's a substantive issue. And that's part of the reason I'm here today, is to share with you, you know, what happens when a policy is misaligned with the markets. In other words, if there were to be some type of a phase out of fossil fuels, particularly in MISO Zone 4, what would be the impact on cost, specifically capacity costs? So now I think we move beyond the policy side. We'll talk a little bit about the money. Is that okay? Good. So raise your hand if you've heard the term capacity, you know, it discussed in your board meetings and like. Okay. So this is how I think about capacity. I grew up in Schaumburg, Illinois, which is German for near the mall. Woodfield Mall. So, Woodfield is a big mall. It's not Mall of America size, but it's really big. And it's got lots of parking spaces, right? So this is a Google Maps view of the mall in the center and then all the parking spots. So when I think about capacity, to me, capacity is the total number of 10,000 parking spaces at Woodfield Mall. Do they need 10,000 spaces every day? No. Do they need it during the week after Thanksgiving? Yes. So guess how many parking spots they have? 10,000 parking spaces, right? That's capacity. So load-serving entities such as co-ops are required to show that they have secured supply and capacity for their members, right? The capacity is, hey, if all of your members are running their air conditioning, have their lights on, and have the pool pump running on a hot summer afternoon, and the aggregated demand is 300 megawatts, you, as the co-op, must show evidence that you have transactional view, or you have control to deliver 300 megawatts into the market to meet that load. Generally speaking, there's some nuance around that, but that's about it. Does this help at all in terms of capacity, or you were already way beyond me? Okay. I always like this example, so it's how I keep things straight in my head. So, Where do you get this capacity from? Well, you've got multiple options. So the MISO works to help calculate the capacity requirement for all of the load-serving entities. They don't dictate it. It's a group project. So all the load-serving entities, the cooperatives, the municipalities, the investor-owned utilities, retail suppliers, they have to secure this capacity. They can own assets, right, like Prairie State. They can have power purchase agreements that deliver capacity as well as energy. They can have planning. They can purchase from the planning resource auction. That's an annual auction that MISO conducts for capacity, right? Or if they don't do any of those things, they could pay this capacity delivery charge, right? Each of these has a different terms, different cost, and they change. So it's a little bit, I don't want to diminish it by calling it a game, but all of the load-serving entities are really kind of competing for capacity resources. In this market, there's more capacity than what is required, so it's a pretty easy game, right? You make a decision, we're going to have a long-term hedge by owning an asset, right? If we own that power plant or a portion of that power plant, that capacity belongs to us. We allocate that against our capacity obligation, right? That's a long-term hedge. Or a power purchase agreement, again, a long-term hedge. Purchasing in the auction is a year-by-year auction, so that's a short-term purchase, right? So by mixing and matching a basket of capacity is how your members get a firm and reliable price for capacity moving forward. Okay? So we have this policy proposal that's being argued over by labor and the environmental community. And it's this concept that has come up in the Clean Energy Jobs Act that they want a zero carbon power sector, right? We don't want carbon emissions from the power sector in Illinois. And this is despite the fact that carbon emissions from the power sector in Illinois have been dropping and are going to continue to drop over the next several years due to market-based retirements of generating capacity, right? If you look in the chart going back to 2019 and then carrying that through, I think, to 2028, we've calculated well, here's the emissions from Energy Information Administration on the historical side, and then we simply backed out the emissions from all the coal plants where there announced retirements. Pretty simple. Another interesting fact is this zero carbon proposal was initially marketed as, well, this is how we're going to comply with the Paris Climate Accords. Illinois is already going to exceed the Paris Climate Accords, based largely on reductions of carbon emissions from the power sector. They don't advertise that anymore because the numbers are out there, right? So in the context of the policy, all right, fine, they want to see coal plants closed by 2035, natural gas plants closed by 2045, and these are for generating assets greater than 25 megawatts in size. So this is actually even going to impact some large cogeneration assets. You know, ADM in Decatur is going to be exposed to this as well. So it's not just load-serving entities, it's also large cogen is going to be impacted. So this is a big deal, right? When people say zero carbon, you start thinking about, okay, well, we're already seeing carbon reductions, and who is this going to impact? And then what's it going to cost me? Those are kind of the rational questions that we would expect. So if you run the numbers today, on the left, you see the bar that shows the stack of capacity resources in MISO Zone 4 right now by resource type, coal, natural gas, nuke, and the like. And you see the blue bar across the middle. That's the local clearing requirement. That's the amount of capacity that needs to be generated from within Zone 4, right? That has to be kind of local generating capacity. So that's today. If you look on the right, we've backed out all of the generating capacity that doesn't fit in the zero carbon constraint. Any observations? Okay, all right. When I've spoken to some of the environmental advocates, and some of these are my friends, right? Not all, some. The response is, well, Mark, we get that, But new wind and solar are going to be incentivized through this bill as well, and that's going to be new capacity in the market, and that will make up the difference. Okay, well, let's test that. You see here a graph that I took down yesterday from Mid-Continent ISO. And it shows in the blue jaggedy line the projected output from wind resources throughout all of Mid-Continent ISO. So in all of MISO, there's 25,000 megawatts of wind. And what they're showing here is yesterday and today's projected schedule for how much wind output we're going to have hour by hour through those 2 days. The green line shows actual as of yesterday about noon. So I'm not here to criticize wind or solar. This is just numbers, right? So when I observed this, I noticed that out of 25,000 megawatts of capacity from wind, only about, or less than 2,000 megawatts of that 25,000 megawatts are going to be available during the heat of the day, the afternoon. Okay, so MISO's noticed this as well, and that's why if you have a 100 megawatt wind farm in MISO, you can sell capacity, right? You have capacity to sell. It's only 10.5% of your nameplate capacity. So out of that 100 megawatts of capacity, you can sell 10.5 megawatts of capacity, right? So what this means for our environmental friends is if you're going to backfill, let me see if I look at that, that worked great. If you're going to backfill what's lost with wind, you're going to have to do 10x the number of megawatts. That's a lot of megawatts, that's a lot of lead time, and that's a lot of transmission system upgrades as well. Because when you connect that 100 megawatt system to the MISO system, they need to have they have to have the ability of carrying 100 megawatts in case that wind farm is generating 100 megawatts. So it's not something you can't overcome, but it takes some time and a bit of expense. Solar is a similar situation. Right now, 50% of a solar asset's nameplate capacity can be credited as capacity. That's probably going to change. And that's because solar capacity can be somewhat variable depending upon weather, and it can change fairly quickly, just like wind. So what we would expect is to see that 50% allocation to drop. 20% is not out of the question, could be a little lower. In Texas, different market, they don't do capacity, but they've been looking at this issue as well since February when they had troubles. And they're taking a real hard look at what is the coincident nature of generating resources, which means when we have peak demand, where are our resources at that time? You know, a lot of these capacity talks are kind of book and accounting transactions, whereas I think now a lot of the ISOs, like MISO, ERCOT, PJM, are now getting a bit more serious about, well, you know, we could kind of pick a number and allocate it to wind or solar because they are only 1%, 2% of the system. Well, if you start getting to 5%, 10%, 20% of the system, and you have radical swings, well, now you're starting to impact the actual reliability of the system, right? So again, I don't want to get too mathy on you, but just think about if you need to replace 8,000 megawatts of capacity in central southern Illinois, that really means that you're probably going to have to actually replace between 60 and 80,000 megawatts. Big, big, big numbers, right? At about $1 million per megawatt, just for the equipment, not counting the transmission upgrades. So, our friends at Prairie Power, Eric Hobby, Robert Reynolds, and Micah, and I have been working on a project, and the project seeks to answer two questions: is what's the likely retirement schedule for capacity in Zone 4 based on this policy, this zero carbon policy, and then what are the potential price impacts on capacity? So we're just doing capacity, not energy, right? And Zone 4, in case anyone needed a refresher, is Illinois, and it's central Illinois, southern Illinois. Zone 4, they're kind of orangey towards the center of the MISO footprint. So Can't be a consultant in this business without having a really busy graph. So this is my busy graph. What we're showing are two things. The blue outlined bars are the megawatts of capacity in Zone 4 that we project can be provided for capacity in a zero carbon policy footprint. This includes retirements driven by that policy, as well as new wind and solar according to the legislative mandate that's put into the legislative proposal. As you see, it drops over time. The blue line shows the cost increase in MISO Zone 4 associated with that policy. It goes up. Solar is in here at 20% capacity, credit for solar, and 10.5% for wind. Mm-hmm. The green bars show capacity if we have business as usual. You know, current retirements, current expected build-outs, same expected build-outs under current legislation. And as you see, there's a green line down towards the bottom. So what we see here are kind of really modest increases in capacity costs under business as usual, really significant increases in costs with the retirements. Now, I'm not saying that everybody's going to be exposed to those prices, especially in the early years. The co-ops are, as I understand it, very much hedged on capacity. You own assets. You can show MISO that you have capacity. And in the near term, I don't think that this impacts the co-ops all that much. Over the longer term, though, as resources are forced out of the market, I think that what happens is the ability to make long-term hedges and provide that cost security for your members goes away. You're going to be directly competing with the retailers, the investor-owned utilities, and the municipals for very limited resources. Make sense? Yeah, we all did high school econ, right? It's the same thing. Supply goes down, price goes up. It goes up rather dramatically here just based on some of the cost structures in the MISO tariff. Here are the details. And just, I would probably just focus on the bottom line number that, you know, under the business as usual case, between now and 2045, you're looking at maybe a $1.4 billion increase in total capacity cost. Over that timeline, that's not terrible, right? That's manageable. That can be hedged, right? And likely that's going to be borne mostly by load-serving entities that do not provide long-term cost certainty to their customers. So that would be the investor-owned utilities and who have their their capacity secured through the Illinois Power Agency, and the retail energy suppliers. So I really don't think that impacts the co-op environment very much at all. Under the other case, the zero carbon case, it's a much bigger number, about 15 billion. And again, as you get further into the timeline, as your resources that you have power purchase agreements with or have ownership interest in, and if those are forced offline, those costs now have to be socialized into all the market participants, largely including the co-ops. So losing the ability to hedge really does get into the key component of your business operation, right? If not now, at some point in the future, your resources, your secured resources for capacity will no longer be available, and you'll have to go out to the market for some alternative. The worst option here is that last option, which is the capacity deficiency payment, where you get to pay, I think the multiple is 2.7 times the cost of new entry for capacity in the market. So that's about $635 a megawatt day. If there are no resources for you to purchase, that's what you pay. Right now, capacity, market-based capacity right now is about $5 a megawatt day. So orders of magnitude. So here are some conclusions, just some things to consider. So in the capacity prices, again, in the near term, I don't think that the policy is necessarily going to impact the prices that are paid by the co-ops because you are more hedged than other market participants. However, over the longer term, you're going to have to compete, right? That could be sooner for some than others. Looking outside the co-op community to your neighbors, right? It's not, hey, you know, you guys are going to get socked and we're not. We're going to look great. Well, your neighboring communities that are not served by the co-ops, they're part of the economic system that supports your members, right? So if they take a price shock in the Ameren served territories, that's going to affect the economic conditions in your service region, right? So in a sense, you may avoid some of these costs in the near term, but as your neighboring communities are exposed to these, that could have an impact on your own economic development and your own drivers. So there is something to be said about being mindful of how this impacts people outside of your immediate members. And then the issue of reliability comes in. You know, capacity, all this talk about capacity and how much you need and all that, that has largely been an accounting type of activity. I think that over time, there's probably going to be a change in the definition of capacity. It's going to have to be firm capacity. It's got to be something that's dispatchable, right? I really do believe that that's going to be part of what has to happen here. PJM, a couple years ago, I think took some of the first steps towards a tighter definition of capacity. And I think that that trend is going to move forward into other regions, possibly even including Mid-Continent ISO. And then in our surrounding regions, you know, we're not an island. There's transmission lines that go into all of our surrounding regions, right? And we can import a significant amount of capacity into this region. We used to be an exporter, probably going to be an importer here fairly soon, right? And in a growing sense. The issue is, yes, that can be a temporary solution, but the policy decisions in Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, you know, anywhere outside of Illinois are going to be driven by policymakers in those states. If that affects the power generating portfolios in those states, they're only going to be concerned with the impacts in their states. They're not going to care about, you know, what happens to those buyers in Illinois that we're selling to now. They're not going to worry about the imports into central and southern Illinois. So really, you have to be very passive in this situation. If you're an importer, you are going to live and pay according to what happens in legislatures where you don't have any representation. And I think that that's going to become a material issue as we start to see shrinkage in the generating portfolio, not only in Illinois, but in our surrounding states. So it's challenging enough to keep up with what happens here in Springfield, but I think ultimately, as groups such as yours, you're probably going to be forced to pay a lot of attention to Indianapolis and Jeff City and other capitals just to understand the decisions that they make for their generating portfolios and how that impacts the access to capacity that's imported into Illinois. So that's all I've got. Sorry there was so much math, but math is what you need to move along with these discussions of policy, and I appreciate your patience, and I'm happy to, we didn't put it on here, but I'm happy to take any questions or.
For some of us who are involved in the electric industry a half a day a month, can you give us your executive summary on the Texas event in February, what the cause was and what we learned from it?
I think the cause in Texas was just-in-time energy production. Just-in-time energy production covers wind, solar, and natural gas. The major failings that I see there were that those assets were not able to operate under those conditions. So I'm not going to blame wind, I'm not going to blame solar. A lot of this came because the natural gas pipeline system didn't deliver gas to critical facilities. Without gas, they can't generate. So any type of asset that can't stockpile its fuel really is not a truly dispatchable resource. And I think that that's what happened. That's my opinion. I'm willing to be wrong. Like I've told people, I've been married for 30 years now. I know how to be wrong. So if you feel I'm wrong, you can tell me to my face, and I can take it. Any other questions or comments? Oh,
Concerning transmission lines, can you kind of expand on that in regards to Illinois, you know, kind of getting across the Mississippi? They're trying to do it up in Wisconsin, and they're having a hard time getting that through. Should that be definitely on our radar other than just generating, you know, the generation end of things?
yeah, I think that's a very insightful question because it's, you know, it's not just about generating, you got to deliver it, right? So I think some of the challenges on the transmission side, at least as I understand it, is the siting and the lead time to bring transmission assets into the process and get them deployed. I really do think that there are some good, honest pushes to bring new transmission lines into Illinois from, say, Iowa, Missouri, the Corn Belt line, and some of these HVDC lines. I think that has to be part of the plan. Here's an interesting fact. Most states have what's called an integrated resource plan, and that's where every couple of years the utilities, the regulators sit down and they say, what are our energy needs? What are our energy assets? What's the gap? What are the options for filling that gap? What's the least cost option? Ready, set, go. You know, deploy to get those solutions, whether they're transmission, generation, efficiency, whatever. Illinois hasn't had an integrated resource plan, and I tried to research this a couple of times. I don't think there's been one since 1996. Who knew that Illinois was a faith-based organization? I think, but all kidding aside, I think that there has to be a considered set of planning. Not that planning is great, not that they're always right, but going through the exercise identifies your needs, and I think that we're flying blind. And if you're going to take resources off the table, you need to find a way to bring new resources on the table. New resource can be generation, or it can be new transmission. So that's a viable option, and I think it needs to be evaluated. Yes, sir. Use your teacher voice.
Yeah, a speaker yesterday talked about the renewables, you know, that we're talking about here, and they mentioned wind and solar, and then they said and other renewables that are coming down the pipe. What other renewables do you see as possible viable options by 2050?
I hear a lot of discussion. I haven't seen any numbers about biomass. I've heard a lot about run-of-the-river hydro. I continue to hear geothermal mentioned as a renewable energy source, but typically in the context of heating and cooling. So it's more of an efficiency resource. That's what I've heard. But you know, there's something to be said for some of the technological enhancements that we're seeing in the wind and solar business. So we're seeing repowering of a few of the original wind farms in Illinois. They're putting whole new, I think they're called nacelles, at the top and the new turbines. And I think on solar, they're getting increased efficiencies, but it's not the big jump that's necessary to really amp up the numbers. I don't know what else they could do. I mean, what is defined as renewables in Illinois is set legislatively as part of the renewable portfolio standard. So landfill gas is in there and a few others, but I don't know what would really fill the gap in terms of especially a dispatchable type asset. Yes?
Well, Mark, thanks for your insight on all this. You know, kind of in the mainstream media, there's a lot of talk about batteries, you know, and that's the solution going forward. And you kind of show the deficiency in capacity. Can you share your perspective on what role batteries you think will have to play and, you know, kind of maybe some on scale per se?
Well, I think batteries are really interesting. I worked with a program called J. Caesar up at Argonne. That was put together, and their drive was to bring down the cost of battery technology by a factor of 4, I think, by 2020. I think it's really interesting. The challenge that I see is that couple-fold. At the micro level, can batteries provide capacity? Yes. Question is for how long, right? And the other thing is that they need to be charged, right? So if you've got a 4-hour battery, but you need 8 hours of deployment, well, now we need twice as many batteries, right? So I think it has a place. Honestly, I've always thought of batteries as being something that could better provide ancillary services. For me, I think that they're great for balancing load, and I think that there's better resources for kind of core capacity, baseload capacity, capacity that's always on. I don't want to poo-poo batteries. I mean, there's probably some great technology out there that's going to be better, faster, cheaper, and I think there's a lot of money going into that now, and maybe that comes about. But at the macro level, I think a lot of the components that go into some of the more popular battery technologies are actually fairly scarce. And now grid batteries might be competing with automotive applications for those same types of resources. So I think that there's some promise there, but I think that there's some constraints that really limit the ability for someone to step in and say, okay, we're going to bring 6,000 megawatts of battery backup into Illinois, and then who pays for it, and all those other details become a bit problematic. But something I've noticed in the policy side, and I'm just noticing things. From the environmental policy maker side, I've noticed that they are usually onto the next big thing. And when I was at the agency, it was wind. After I left the agency, it's solar is really their focus. Now it's EVs, and I think that the next big thing is probably going to be stationary batteries. So, they're always keeping an eye on what's the next big thing. I wish that maybe we could solve some of the challenges with the last big thing before we move on to the next big thing. But I've had teenagers as well as being married, and I know that you don't necessarily have a control over the cadence of what's hot. Everyone enthused? We're going to solve this? I don't want to be a downer. You got to go into another meeting. Any other questions? Yes.
So synopsize this for me, so when I go home and I'm talking to my friends who haven't sat at this meeting and don't know anything about this, and I'm a new director, so it's kind of new green for me too. Mm-hmm. Synopsize this for me in a way that I can have this conversation over a cocktail. Give me a talking
Before
point.
or after the cocktails are served?
During.
During. Interesting.
But, I mean, so what do we tell? What is the 5 sentences that we tell to get this message across? Because it's extremely complicated.
It is. I would first rely on the expertise that your G&T co-ops provide, right? So it's not just me talking. I think that your G&Ts are a huge resource for this, and they probably have something very specific to your service region. On a very general note, I would say that there are policies being proposed that on their face are great. Everybody wants less pollution. Everybody wants more sustainability. I think it was mentioned earlier today that's the buzzword, right? But 2 things. That comes at a cost. Convenience and money. So the money we talked about, right? It can be very expensive because it's supply and demand. If you take certain supply out of the market, the price goes up. I think that can, even after cocktail 1, that one fits. Moving on to the convenience issue, that gets to reliability, and that's a bit more complex. And there are a lot of organizations that are focused on solving the reliability issue. Your G&Ts, Mid-Continent ISO, PJM, FERC. They're all working through this. So this isn't saying, hair's on fire, all is lost. It's saying that there are definite problems out there, and that what you want to do as an organization is to continue to keep this in focus and as a priority so that you are always mindful of where the progress is. if there's a lack of progress, that means that you as an organization need to instigate and try to move that forward. Because and again, if there's policymakers in the room, and I don't mean to be insulting, but from a policymaker, they're going to vote and pass this, and they're moving on to the next thing, right? So everybody here gets to live with it. And I think that when we talk about reliability, that really gets to the core of your economic development, health, safety, all that type of thing. So the long term is a challenge. Okay, so the first thing we've done is we identified that directionally, this might not be the right way to go. So what are the alternatives? So starting to think about what alternatives you can bring forward, be it efficiency, demand response, new resources, how are we going to plan through this? Again, I think the planning process is helpful because it helps to identify these issues. And then as you identify the issues, you can start to identify some solutions. The worst of all worlds is you come up and there's no solution. Well, I don't think we get there. We've been able to solve, and Eric mentioned this to me the other day and reminded me, you know, we've dealt with mercury, you know, rules. We've dealt with a lot of rules around coal and gas and emissions. So there are solutions out there. We haven't started talking about those solutions because we haven't identified the problem. So we identified a problem, cost, reliability. How do we as an organization start to work through the solutions generating process? So that's kind of long-winded, and you're 2 cocktails in if it's me already, and you know, not coherent at all. But I would say, you know, it's something that we have to work on, and there's no immediate solution. So we need the commitment to not just put the bumper sticker on and say, you know, 100% or bust, you know, 100% renewable or 100% anything. We need to have organizations that hedge for us, hedge not only on the financial side, but also hedge on the reliability side. And that's where I think your organization is much better suited and positioned than the rest of the state. The rest of the state is completely flying blind, right? Your organizations do a lot of planning. I can attest to that. So if anyone's going to have a solution, it's probably from folks within this room. Hope that helps. Okay, I'm getting the cut, so thank you very much.